So, have you been keeping an eye on what's happening in South Asia? Because if you're just catching the headlines, you might think it's a bunch of isolated protests. But it's not. What we're actually seeing is a single unfolding story of rebellion, a pattern that's shaking the entire region to its core.
And the pattern is, well, it's pretty striking when you lay it out. In 2022, we had Sri Lanka, 2024, Bangladesh, and then 2025, Nepal. That's three different countries, three governments, all toppled in just a few years by the sheer power of the public. This isn't a coincidence, folks. This is a wave.
So, what is going on here? What's driving this incredible wave of protest? Well, these events are revealing this common South Asian pattern. It's like a blueprint for youth-led revolts, and it's totally redefining the political game.
At the heart of it all is a really clear conflict. On one side, you've got a new generation. They're digitally savvy, they're connected, and they are just not willing to accept the status quo anymore. And on the other side, you've got these entrenched political elites who've been benefiting from a system of misrule for years. It's a classic story, really, but with a very modern digital twist. Okay, so every fire needs fuel, right? What was the fuel for all this widespread anger? The answer, and it's a big one, is the economy. This wasn't just some abstract political frustration. This was an economic tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. And you can see the shared pain so clearly when you break it down. In Sri Lanka, it was a total debt default that led to these crippling shortages of, well, everything. In Bangladesh, it was a desperate lack of jobs for educated young people. And in Nepal, you had soaring inflation and corruption that was just out of control. The specific symptoms were a little different, but the disease was exactly the same, an economy that had completely collapsed, making everyday life pretty much impossible.
So who was it on the front lines leading this charge? Well, it was Gen Z, a digitally native generation that stepped up and took command. You know, their main weapon wasn't a rock or a protest sign. It was their phone. Social media basically became the central nervous system for these movements. It let protesters organize, share info, and completely bypass state-controlled media, all at lightning speed. Now, the authorities, of course, they saw this happening, and they saw it as a huge threat. So in Nepal, the government tried to just pull the plug. They banned popular social media platforms, hoping it would choke off the uprising. But this move backfired, spectacularly. The ban didn't silence anybody. Instead, it became this perfect symbol of the exact censorship and oppression they were fighting against. It basically proved their point for them, and it just galvanized the resistance, pouring way more fuel on the fire. Now let's be super clear about who the protesters were fighting. This wasn't just some vague anger at the system. No, they had very specific targets, the corrupt elites they saw as being directly responsible for their country's problems. And a huge part of their grievance was something called nepotism, this practice where people in power favor their own friends and family, handing out jobs and opportunities based on who you know, not what you know. What this meant in the real world was that ruling families were basically using the state as their own personal piggy bank. They built systems to shield themselves from any kind of accountability, making them seem untouchable. And this wasn't subtle stuff. It was blatant, in-your-face corruption that made people angrier and angrier every single day. So with all this anger building up and a government that just refused to listen, a collision was pretty much inevitable. And the peaceful protests, well, they soon reached a violent and tragic breaking point. Instead of trying to talk or offering reforms, the state came back with force. The government's reaction was swift, it was brutal, and it was incredibly heavy-handed, which escalated the crisis almost immediately. The human cost was just staggering. We're talking hundreds of people dead in the crackdowns in Bangladesh alone. The authorities were using live ammunition against their own citizens. It's just unbelievable. And the result was this awful, vicious cycle. Mass arrests became routine. In Nepal, entire cities were destabilized by arson and running street battles. And with every act of violence, the governments didn't regain control. They just destroyed whatever little legitimacy they had left. So after all the smoke cleared, what was the end result? The leaders were gone, yes, but what they left behind is a deeply, deeply fragile future for the whole region. And it's so important to understand how these leaders left. These were not orderly democratic handovers. They didn't lose an election and give a nice speech. No, They were driven out of their palaces and offices by pure, overwhelming public fury. And that really is the big takeaway here. These uprisings are more than just a change in leadership. They're a massive warning sign. They expose democracies that have been totally hollowed out from the inside by decades of patronage, corruption, and inequality. Tearing down a broken system is one thing. Building a better one, that's a whole different challenge. So we're left with this powerful new reality. A young, connected, and restless generation all across South Asia is just not willing to accept misrule anymore. They've proven they can topple governments. But these victories create a power vacuum, and the path from protest to stable governance is a treacherous one. The pattern is set, which leaves us with the critical question: what or who breaks next?